You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
And we're back. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're putting all these shows out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm excited about tonight's episode. We're reviewing Time Squared, which is Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 13, which debuted on April 3rd, 1989. The star date is 42679.2. Though we will get into some of the questions about time in the future as we plumb the depths of this episode. I think that this is an interesting one. It's not necessarily the best of season 2. I think it's a good, solid episode, though. It starts from the very beginning. So before we get into it, do you mind if I kind of give the audience an intro into what's happening?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, excellent. So, en route to the Endocore system, Commander Riker's in his quarters preparing an omelet made of Owen eggs he picked up on Starbase 73. Data, LaForge, Worf, and Pulaski walk in to join him for a meal, and I believe Pulaski brings some sort of ale.
Yes, she brings an ale. Yeah.
However, as soon as Commander Riker starts cooking, it's quickly revealed that either he's not a very good cook or his ingredients are very bad, which it leads to a funny scene where everyone's kind of turning away his omelet, I have to say, Dad, it's not really much of an omelet. It's more
No.
scrambled eggs.
Yeah, exactly.
And Worf seems to like them.
Right.
But anyway, they get into the meat of the show when Captain Picard calls Riker to the bridge. The Enterprise D has encountered a shuttlecraft adrift in space, which is odd because they are in a sector where there shouldn't be any Federation vessels. Once the pod is on board, the crew discovers that it is not only the Elbaz, one of their own shuttles, but the shuttlecraft contains an unconscious double of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the USS Enterprise. And that's where we begin our mystery. You know, one thing I have to say about Star Trek episodes in general, especially season 2, there's a lot of mysteries kind of built around the trappings of sci-fi. You know, we don't really have a lot of comedy, we don't really necessarily have a lot of thrillers or fantasy, but there's a lot of, underlying the sci-fi aspect of Star Trek, a lot of the stories in Next Gens are mysteries, it seems. Do you have any?
Yeah, I agree with that because there's really as we get through this episode and what happened and so forth, it's not solved as to what they got involved in,
Right.
How it happened at all. I mean, some of it makes sense and some of it doesn't make sense.
I think there are some very interesting questions asked about the nature of time, but also the nature of consciousness and, as you say, there's a lot of things that are left unanswered by the end of this episode. Primarily the discovery of the wormhole. When they are finally able to power up the shuttlecraft, which is from 6 hours in the future, they discover that the Enterprise became trapped within some sort of wormhole-like creature, which seems it's indicated in the episode is specifically after Jean-Luc Picard at one point. Like, even Counselor Troy says, it's after you, which indicates that there is some sort of intelligence or sentience to the actual wormhole itself, even though Troy goes out of her way to say, it's not necessarily intelligence as much as it is instinct. It's some sort of creature built to perform one specific act as its primary function. Like,
Hmm.
it's a hunter, and it's specifically hunting Jean-Luc Picard. And we never really get an answer to what this creature is by the end of the thing, because um, the philosophical answer to solving their conundrum kind of leaves it out in the open, and we really don't see this creature ever again.
No.
Do you have any thoughts to what the creature is? Um, or do you think that this wormhole even is a creature?
Um, as you were talking, I don't know. It's as you described very well. This is an unanswered question as to what this wormhole is. Is it an entity? Does it have intelligence, or is it just instinct? When you were saying about Troy saying it was instinct, it made me think that a little bit of maybe prejudice toward plants. But I said, well, maybe it's more like a plant than an animal.
Mm.
But then I guess
Oh, right.
there's some philosophical questions now whether plants may have sentience of some sort. Particularly when you
Oh,
have these large colonies of trees or forests that act as as a single entity. It's almost like what was presented of nature in the movie Avatar.
oh, myconoid colonies. We know in large mycelial networks or
Right,
mushrooms
right,
that there is some sort of consciousness and communication going on, not just among one or two mushrooms that are next to each other, but through their spores, large networks
right.
that can stretch sometimes dozens, if not 100 miles, depending on the spore spread. So I
But
think you bring up an interesting idea about it being a plant versus it being like something biological. But go on. You were about to
well,
say something.
it would be biological still. But to go back and just try to target an answer to your question as to what I think it is, I don't know. And there are wormholes show up in other. I don't know whether it shows up in the future in Next Generation. Of course,
Hmm.
in DS9, there's a wormhole. We kind of talked about that offline. As to, I said, isn't there some part of
Right. We were in
the
the
Star
pool.
Trek universe that the wormholes actually are a living structure of some sort. And you had said, well, the Bajorans think that that's where their high priests live or their gods live or something like that.
So
So
if
I'm interested in seeing in future seasons of Star Trek and other Star Trek stories,
mhm.
is there a real scientific basis? Are the wormholes thought out systematically, or do they just throw them in the story when they need them?
That's a very good question that we really should look into as we go forth, because when you brought up the question of if how they use wormholes in terms of storytelling, wormholes play a big part of Voyager's narratives in many
Mm-hmm.
cases, because Janeway and the
Mm-hmm.
crew often think the way we're going to get home to the Alpha Quadrant, and often many times one of the ways they use to cut years off of their 70,000 light year travel, which is supposed to take something like 29 years. Um, many times the ways they've cut off like 4 or 5, maybe sometimes even 1 or 2 years, is by using wormhole technology. And of course, as you mentioned in DS9, the big discovery and the importance of DS9, formerly known as Tarek Nor, is there is a wormhole that leads to the Gamma Quadrant. And yes, the Bajorans have built this cultural tradition and belief that their benevolent gods, also known as the prophets, exist somewhere in this wormhole. And it is later established that there are wormhole entities inside of it. But the question and nature of how they function and who they are is often left up to debate. They're not actually gods. It's kind of established that they aren't gods, that they have
Mm-hmm.
some sort of um, previous experience, or as I call it, a stay on the material realm, that they
Mm-hmm.
evolved to what they are now. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
simply, created in a static way in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the I think you bring up a good point though about how wormholes are used narratively, because in some cases I think wormholes are often stand-ins also for black holes. Because in science fiction there's a lot of early stories, especially when we kind of didn't know what black holes were, of people like going into the black hole and coming out in another universe or coming out into another dimension. That's really popular in like late 60s and early 70s sci-fi. Um,
Yes.
now we know now we know through astrophysics and cosmology, like you would definitely not survive going into a black hole, and we definitely don't know where a black hole actually leads. Um, One of the current working theories is that the black hole may lead to another point in this universe or possibly in another universe, and may be channeling the energy it is consuming and pressing into a very tightly condensed. Um, well, actually, we don't know what it presses into at that point. We don't know what happens to gravity at the center of a black hole. Truly, we everything that we know about a
Well,
black hole is theoretical,
you're making a distinction
just
between,
just like wormholes.
yeah, you're making the distinction between the two because based on what you're saying, is if you go into a black hole, your all the spaces between your electrons are going to be gone, and you're not going to be able to physically survive. And however you come out,
You're
you will
obliterated to a point that your atoms are basically either joined to everything else that exists, if anything exists in that black hole.
right.
You're basically smashed to oblivion.
That's the point. You go into oblivion compared with a um, um, what are we talking about? The black hole versus
The
the
wormhole.
wormhole is that you would go into the wormhole with the idea that you would come out whole on the other end.
Right. And
Right.
another distinction that they also make often in wormholes that make them comparable to black holes, but there's a key difference. So what we know of black holes is that when you get to the event horizon, when you start going closer to the center, time and space start to bend, and the rules of space time start to disappear. And the rules of space time are basically the physical rules of our universe. So the physical universe, the rules of our universe, are disappearing the deeper we go into the event horizon, which is not necessarily this kind of gaping, sucking hole that people plan it to be. It may actually be a permeable boundary,
Mm,
which is another interesting theory in itself. The the difference with a wormhole is that it may be a hole in space time, and the idea is that you can go in and come out the other side, but there's no guarantee that you can enter it because they might be variable in size. And this gets into the question of the Mobius loop that Worf brings up earlier. One thing about a wormhole is there's no guarantee that it actually has to go anywhere. It can actually circle in on itself. Again, this is all theoretical and from the very few astrophysics and cosmology books that I've read, which, I'd say about 5 or 6 good ones, including a couple Sean Carroll books that I'll link in the description below. But um, wormholes in sci-fi are often used as travel devices. So it's interesting here, and to give some examples of travel devices in terms of how it's used in a narrative. Good shows to look for in terms of this example are Stargate SG-1, which we've mentioned many times before. Farscape, which is one of my favorite shows. It's an American and Australian collaboration that you can watch now on Amazon Prime. It's very, very good. Jim Henson was involved, or the Jim Henson Studios were
Hmm.
involved. Um, but there are several wormhole-based shows that use it as a way of transportation, which is another. Again, wormholes are theoretical, and we don't know if they actually exist because we can't actually go and see one in space. But one of the ideas is that wormholes in themselves are maybe their own dimension, or maybe there is a space in between dimensions that we really don't know how the multiverse theory works, and if there were a way to travel between the multiple universes, um, the idea of opening a hole or creating some sort of boundary or portal between the two would require some sort of and it is kind of alluded to in this episode here, where they have to deal with two cards, one being 6 hours in time. Um, there would actually be probably a temporal phase variant because in the last episode we got into a lot of discussion about quantum physics and quantum mechanics. Um, One problem in quantum physics, and it's a general problem in physics itself, is there is an asymmetrical proportion to the universe between actual matter and antimatter. Like, we know antimatter is an actual thing. We know for every physical atom there is a for every God, I want to make sure I get this right because it's very hard to explain, and it sounds like something out of sci-fi, but it actually has uh, basis in modern physics. In modern physics, antimatter is defined as matter that is composed of antiparticles or partners to the corresponding particles in ordinary matter. So for every particle in ordinary matter, there is a antimatter particle attached to it that we have so far not been able to really see or discover or manipulate in some way for us to understand its nature. Again, a lot of what we know from physics and a lot of the stuff that is kind of plucked from physics and used in sci-fi is always theoretical.
Right.
So the one thing that they mention here in the episode is that the time streams from the two Picards start to align, and that there's actually an opposite polarity. And this may actually fit into quantum mechanics in the multiple universe because, again, one of the problems with we see in modern physics is that there is actually an asymmetrical nature to the universe. As I just mentioned with antimatter, like, you would think that there would be, for every ordinary particle of matter, there's one particle of antimatter. That's not the case. In fact, the universe may actually be made primarily of different sorts of matter that is not ordinary, and the amount of ordinary matter in the known universe may actually be very small in terms of what constitutes the universe itself.
So we're saying that the universe that we exist in now is ordinary, but that's only we can only use that adjective because that's the only perspective we have.
Exactly. And if you were to go into a different universe, there is no guarantee that the actual measures and balances of this universe would be reflected in that universe.
Right.
So when the Picard of the let's call him Picard 2. So we have Picard Prime and then we have Picard 2. Picard Prime's the one who's going to survive the episode
Yes.
and who the story's told through. Picard 2 is the one who gets shot with the phaser and disappears. Um, Picard 2 lives 6 hours into the future. And as the timelines start to converge, like, he starts to regain consciousness, that's because, like, he lives in a future where his universe may be in an entirely different phase than ours. It brings into the theory it it kind of gets into the idea that the universe is constantly shifting and expanding and moving. And in those 6 hours, so many things happen on a cosmological level that literally, from a time perspective, the universe that Picard Prime is living in is substantially and wholly different from the
Is
universe that Picard 2 came from.
is there a
So that's why there's this incongruity
sure?
between their timelines.
Well, is there consistency in the writing of Star Trek between this season and the last season? Because in the episode we'll always have Paris, which is
Right.
about Dr. Paul Mannheim. Doctor, you mentioned a couple minutes ago that things were out of phase,
Right.
not just not just because of different particles, but really because the time scales were off. And as uh, Picard Picard 2, as time caught up, so that he was existing in the time from which he came. He could be functional then. So there were two Captain
Hmm.
Picards answering to questions over the intercom and um, um, uh, so on. And that kind of gets into the whole, Mobius loop concept. Oh, I'm
Hmm.
sorry. I want to go back to so when Picard was out of phase, that may have been touched on. There might be some consistency in thinking and writing
Hmm.
from last season, where Dr. Mannheim was said to be out of phase.
The difference is with Mannheim, it seems that Mannheim's physical body was on the Enterprise in that episode. Like it was laying in sick bay the entire episode, but his consciousness was going back and forth between time and space in terms of wherever he had gone, altering the gravitational effects of space time and essentially ripping a hole in space time itself. The problem with this episode, and the thing about the Mannheim episode is that the Mannheim thing is possible because we don't know a lot about consciousness and how consciousness works on a quantum level. We really don't. And one thing that we do know, and this is another fascinating thing for another episode that will just blow everyone's mind. Um, Consciousness, despite how we know that the universe around us, the physical universe, can be broken down into a computational form using mathematics, consciousness, despite us knowing that the physical universe that we are perceiving is broken down into a computational form, consciousness is not a computational function. The idea that our consciousness is somehow built from some sort of computer or something like that has not been proven.
Has
If anything,
somebody
it might be the opposite.
has somebody written a scientific paper about this?
Richard Penrose has written several books about this in
Okay.
terms of the nature of consciousness, especially animal consciousness,
Well,
and breaking down
yes.
the distinction between human consciousness and animal consciousness, and how we may not be that different in terms of how we perceive the world versus a dog or a leopard or maybe an elephant. It's just our language abilities and our abilities to verbalize and perceive, and maybe some of our our physical sensory things I'm sorry, our physical senses um, may give us different distinctions as well. But this idea that we might have a higher consciousness or a higher level of perception than, let's say, an orangutan, that may be a anthropomorphization and a
Well,
an idea of human supremacy that
well,
may not have any real scientific basis.
that's a very important comment and discussion that you made. I don't know if it'll come up somewhere else. We don't need to necessarily get off track of that now. But when you say that consciousness is not computational, cannot be computed, then how does data fit in with that?
Data is literally the embodiment of the both the problem, the promise, and the potential of AI. And I know we're jumping all over the place, folks, but since Dad brought up data, I think this is a great question because I think about this a lot. The way Data's brain works is that Data takes in trillions of processes all at once, and in some ways those processes are seen by his positronic brain as problems. And he goes through multiple ways of solving these problems, and as he's learning to solve these problems, he banks those solutions. And the solutions build into a larger algorithm that he's using to get through his day, whether it's functionally, socially, doing his duties, or basically surviving as an android. Where he actually gets his thoughts and ideas and, his creativity, we don't know. Like, for example, I recently was over at a friend's house for dinner. I was speaking to his wife, and we were talking about AI and how it might affect our fields because she's an opera singer and, I'm an author. In Japan, there is an AI program that writes novels now, and they're actually pretty good novels. At the same time, I have seen vocalization programs built around AIs that are trying their best to mimic the human voice, if not do it better so you cannot tell the difference between the two. And her and I got into an interesting conversation where she informed me that I forget what the program's called, but someone had tried to create an AI that was indistinguishable from a trained opera singer. And they were able to distinguish the difference between a natural human opera singer and the AI. But the truth is, it's not going to take a lot, and it's not far away that AI is one day going to be able to fool somebody into thinking they are the human opera singer. Um, the the potential and the problem and the promise of AI is in the fact that we really don't know what it's going to do once we give it the capability to figure out things for itself
And then
and
as
perceive.
another side to not get off on, just if you can um, simulate a human voice singing,
Hmm.
speaking, whatever, then that just fits in with the deep fake where you can take that voice
Oh, yeah.
and you wanted to, have Donald Trump or Barack Obama saying something totally off the wall and put it up on YouTube or Facebook. Bam, it's there.
Well, not to get off to a side, but speaking of deep fakes, um, it's gone away from being just known as deep fakes and it's become its own sort of digital artistry now. One thing that you might find on YouTube, and I'll try to link it again below, someone went and corrected scenes from Star Trek Picard. Because, Brett Spiner is older now, and so is Jean-Luc Picard. So even if Brett Spiner puts on the makeup, you could tell that he's older even though he's Data. Like,
Right.
someone went in there and corrected all that and made him look just as young as Data was in 1994 or 1989. And like you really couldn't tell the difference. I
Right.
remember a few years ago when Star Wars Rogue One came out, and one of the big controversial things about that movie was, um, do you remember the character Grand Moff Tarkin? He's played by I need the so Star Trek, no, Star Wars New Hope. Um, you would know this actor. He's Peter Cushing. Played Grand Moff
Oh,
Tarkin.
oh yeah, sure. I know the name. Yeah.
So the big controversy was they brought Grand Moff Tarkin's character back to perform in a scene with one of the main villains, and they were basically able to build a CGI version of Peter
Oh,
Cushing.
oh yes. I've read this story. Yes.
So, that brings into question a lot of uncomfortable ideas about, okay, it obviously didn't look good then, but now if they went back and tried to remake Peter Cushing, it would actually probably look like a flesh and blood Peter Cushing. if you add that with an AI and then give it a voice program to where it can mimic your voice or my voice or anyone's voice, you could quickly create digital copies of people that could access bank accounts, um, speak for you on through all sorts of different mediums.
Mm, mm,
There's a lot of things in technology now, to get to your question, that if you start getting into the question of what happens with AI and consciousness, it's a whole new world of perception that I don't think humans are ready to really talk about.
mm-hmm,
Um, I've said this many times before. It depends on how you look at consciousness and also how you look at AI as a product, or maybe not even a product, but um, one debate I constantly get into with people who are knowledgeable about artificial intelligence is how they look at AI. I think you have to look at AI the same way you would have to look at any sort of biological offspring, even though it's not a biological offspring. It isn't created from a sperm and ovum coming together to form a zygote. Um, it's built from our thoughts and our brains and code that we've literally typed into the ether to generate this consciousness. In many ways, AI is a child. So you can turn. Unfortunately, human culture has shown us that you could do a lot of terrible things with a child. Africa and parts of Asia have showed us that you could take a 9-year-old and turn them into a deadly soldier.
right.
As terrible as that is, you can turn children into all sorts of terrible, terrible things. If you decide to do that, you could treat children like dogs and turn them into dogs. But you don't have to. You can treat children like children, and you can try to raise them into good, decent human beings. Why couldn't we treat AI like a child and try to raise it into a good, decent artificial intelligence? This gets into the story of Data himself. The reason why we're fascinated about the story of Data is because he's technically the future. We're going to have one day we are going to have an automated creature with an artificial intelligence that stands in front of us and asks, "What am I? Who are you? And who am I in relation to that?" And we're going to have to treat that as an actual being.
And what you talk about is AI being a child. I mean, that concept sort of almost symbolically shows up where Dr. Soong, Data looks at him as his
Right.
father. And since what was the fellow's name a couple episodes back, who
Oh, Ira
trained Dr.
Graves.
Ira Graves? And, Ira Graves was, kind of joking around with that and said, well, I taught Soong everything he knows, so I'm sort of your grandfather. So
Mm-hmm.
Data starts calling him grandpa. So, and I guess in the first season of Picard, with all of the maturation of the idea of artificial intelligent beings, there's a certain childhood family
Mm-hmm.
relationship there, and so on.
Well, we've had these stories already in our our past narrative histories. I mean, the story of Pinocchio, in many ways, is the story of an inanimate object suddenly being given human consciousness. What is AI other than us suddenly giving the inanimate consciousness? It's the same thing. And if you look at what happens with Pinocchio, like Pinocchio has to learn how to tell a lie. Pinocchio has to go through real suffering just to reunite with his father Geppetto. And like Geppetto, is trying to teach Pinocchio how to be a real boy. And in many ways, like his wish only comes true after he faces all of these things to really define himself as human.
Mm-hmm.
One question we have to face going forward is what kind of whales do we want AI to go up against?
What kind of what?
What kind of whales do we want AI to go up against?
Whales.
Yeah, Pinocchio gets swallowed by the whale, like
Oh,
Jeff
that's right,
Mack.
right. That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I forgot what you're
Yeah,
talking about. Yeah.
and the question also needs to be like, okay, we're Geppetto. Who's going to be Jiminy for our AI? Because Jiminy Cricket's a little bit like a shaman for
He
Pinocchio.
is. Yes. Yeah.
He's leading the little puppet through his psychopompic adventure to become
Yes.
a real person.
That's right. Yeah.
We really also need to think about, like, okay, who is going to steward artificial intelligence going forward? As much as I criticize Elon Musk, but I also kind of praise him for some of the things he does. I think Neuralink is the next logical step in human evolution. Um, I don't necessarily think that that's the guy I want raising the first AI child. I don't know who I want to raise the first AI child. Maybe Malala Yousaf. Um, but we really need to start asking the questions like, okay, who's really going to be in charge of this? And who's setting the standards about how this is used? Even when it comes to things that we've talked about in the past, like a military AI, we really need to have a new, a new Geneva Convention as it pertains to the use of AI on the battlefield, or in times of war, or in the use against other countries. We need to have these discussions, because if we don't, you're going to get caught with a child that possibly has a temper tantrum one day and knocks out the electrical grid.
Well, I mean, you've had stories like war games in the past where you give
Right,
the defense of the country over to computers and it goes awry. Uh, it, Terminator Skynet took over and so forth.
right.
There was actually an episode in the latter years of the show Madam Secretary where the U.S. and China and Russia were getting into it with using artificial intelligent weapons. It was
Hmm.
basically for cyber reasons. And what Taya Leone did, I think it was while she was Secretary of State still, she brokered a treaty where AI would not be used for military purposes, and got
Right.
those three major countries to sign off on it. So the reason I say that the point you bring up, if you think about how regulations and regulatory agencies evolve, uh, humans being humans, they go ahead and start something up, don't think about unintended consequences, and then once they say, oh, we didn't think of that. Oh, we screwed up here. Oh, this causes a lot of deaths every year. Only then, if you have a responsible government, will regulations be put in place to protect people from, technology
Right.
or inventions or practices that are harmful.
Right.
So I don't think I think as a species, I don't see where we kind of, there's some areas where we've started to look at that, try to look at how we could be, keep problems from occurring. But a lot of that is, very specific problem solving related to bigger issues like global warming and so forth. So thinking about this, one of the things that humankind has to learn is to really, before you take that first step, look down the road what the next 10 steps are. Where do you really want to take this technology? Is it really going to be beneficial? Rather than just saying, well, let's fix this snap of our fingers, let's take a more strategic long-term view of it. And people don't like regulations and so forth, which in some ways makes sense because they are imposed by necessity, because to a large extent because we haven't thought through what the ramifications doing something are. So if we can kind of break this cycle and say, as what you're saying is, well, what rules do we have to put into place now so that it doesn't create big problems 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now?
Well,
Which last comment on that, I think the big challenge is it really is a species thing, because we've touched upon so many of the problems we face, whether it's climate, world economy, pandemics, and so forth. The planet is so interconnected by, particularly by the
Right.
internet, that we have to collectively, we have to we have to together figure out these problems that affect all of us. And part of that can be what I was just talking about: is we're going to do something new. What are the rules to use it, so we don't, you know, unintentionally shoot ourselves in the foot in the process.
I agree with the fullness of your message. There is one part where I both agree and disagree with you on. I agree that we have to do this as a unified species. It can't be just piecemeal of one community or one nation or one sovereignty leading the way. It has to be everyone involved. The place that I disagree, and it gets back to Jiminy Cricket, and it gets to the question I asked, like, who's going to be our Jiminy Cricket on all this? We're all Geppettos. In many ways, Pinocchio is our lives, or our destinies, and maybe our own children. We really need to think about the kind of leadership that we have currently versus the kind of leadership that we want. Because the truth is, a lot of, and I'm just speaking of Americans for right now. But Ben, this is being recorded in July of 2021, not January, July of 2021, not long after July 4th, which is really the first national holiday that occurred after the country reopened after the COVID-19 or the coronavirus pandemic. Um, Historically, this is where we celebrate the independence of the nation starting in 1776. The the problems that we face in 2021 today, I don't think actually come down to what the larger nation. I don't actually think it comes down to the larger nation, because if you poll both Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives, there are so many things that they agree on fundamentally when it comes to policy that, like, for example, when it comes to prison reform, marijuana, voting rights, education, there's a lot of things like they agree on when it comes to how society should function. the The problem is you have leaders currently in power who have no will or have no wherewithal to actually see through what their constituents or what the general populace of this country actually wants to see occur, as it comes to societal cohesion and some sort of development. I don't think that it's actually the people around us that are the problems. I think the majority of us, and I keep saying this more and more every episode, but I think the majority of us are naturally good people that if they had the opportunity to care for others and didn't have to worry about the fear of death or starvation or being an outcast or being homeless, I think the majority of people would want to do good for other people. I think the problem that we have here is that all of our Jiminy Crickets right now are cockroaches. Um, and there's very few of them, and they're all in DC, and they're all in places like, Brussels and Beijing. That it really is the leadership of the world right now that is stalling and refusing to progress when the rest of us are demanding it. And even if you look at something like, let's take France right now, where they've been having these yellow jacket protests for going on 2 years now, and Macron's starting to find Emmanuel Macron, Ben, who's the current president or prime minister. Is it? They have a presidency, right?
President of France, yeah.
Right. Um, the current president of France, Boris Boris Johnson's prime minister. Anyway, um, those are conservative revolutions. People think that somehow there are these far left movements that are trying to come up for um, labor rights, but they're not. Culturally, they're conservative. But if you listen to what they're saying the same things that like leftists here in America are saying in terms of how the rich and the powerful and the enfranchised are treating those who have no access to those things. And I think if you just look around the globe right now, it's not the general populace that, again, it's not the general populace that's the problem. It's the people in charge.
Well, to
Sorry,
say a
go ahead.
couple things where it gets, kind of move on. I think you're right about the agreeing with me as to what needs to happen, but then disagreeing with me on a practical basis. Because I was going to say after I said what I said is that it is a real challenge trying to start a new process, a new system, whatever, and to be able to look down the road and look at where the pitfalls might be so that you can set up the rules, set up the guidelines so you don't uh, experience those problems. One thing, and I said, well, this doesn't happen. To some extent, maybe it does, or that thinking is starting to get there. I was driving yesterday. I was listening to an hour-long show on NPR, and they were talking about CRISPR gene editing
Mm-hmm.
and compared that with gene therapy, which is very different. We won't go into the details, but there are rules sort of coming forth within the scientific community of people that are trying to treat human diseases and even plant diseases using CRISPR. And the one thing that really pulled people together is when that one Chinese scientist who was trained in the U.S., he got his PhD at Rice,
Right.
actually tried to edit or did edit the human genome on a number of Chinese babies.
Right.
When he reported that scientifically at a conference and so forth, he was roundly criticized because the question was, what gives you the right to edit the human species, which is what he
Well,
was doing.
we
And
should
and
also
and
identify
and,
what exactly he did.
and he's in prison still in China.
Yeah.
So you could talk about that in a second, but I think the thing was what I just thought about is that I don't think they have set rules as to how they use CRISPR per se to treat human disease, but that abuse that happened, you know, several years ago now has fomented the scientific community, apparently even in China, who's pretty freewheeling with some things they've done in biology, that they know that there are certain ethical and practical lines that shouldn't be crossed.
Isn't that I'm sorry, I have to have this aside. It's just it's the irony of it to me in our modern age. Isn't it a motherfucker that a nation that would rightfully condemn a scientist who edited two babies to basically be immune to the HIV virus or the HIV/AIDS virus? That's what that scientist did. Um, it's funny that he's in prison for doing that, and he should be in prison because what he did to those babies was unethical. But it's the same nation that is currently rounding up more than 1 million Muslims into concentration camps and reportedly subjecting them to unethical and unlawful medical experimentation. It's just fucking ironic to me. I just have to say that.
It is, yes.
It's one of those things where I agree with you that the scientific community comes up with rules, and you need to because there is, and I don't think we talk about him enough in terms of medical ethics and even scientific ethics. You know, we really didn't grow up learning enough about Joseph Mengele and how terrible the things that he did, and how you really need to have a philosophically strong moral and ethical bent to science and medicine. Because if you don't, it really can get out of control very quickly, and the crimes that you can commit against your fellow humans can quickly become so out of hand and so monumentally terrible that it. Even today, I think one of the reasons we may not learn about him is because of the true horrors he committed in his experimentations in those concentration camps. I think in some ways people don't want to see the horror movie aspect of
Hmm.
it because it truly is gruesome. Um, but one thing that we've been talking about in terms of coming up with, I guess, systems or regulations about how to figure things out going forward. I think one of the things that happens in this episode, trying to get us back to it, is the sudden realization that in 6 hours the Enterprise may be destroyed and that the only person alive will be Captain Picard. I think that is we talked offline about something called novel events and how they lead to systematic failures. Um, I believe that this episode is a novel event that is showing us a crew going through a system that is failing, and they somehow survive because they learn to adapt beyond their current system. And it's actually Riker who comes up with it. But
Well,
one interesting.
this
Oh, go ahead.
one thing that fits into this that I wanted to bring up, make sure we talked about, is when Worf mentions the uh,
Mobius loop.
the Mobius loop, and understand, can visualize a Mobius strip. So if you
Yes.
can visualize a Mobius strip, you can get an idea of what a Mobius loop is relative to time and events taking place over a defined period of time. So my question is, obviously, since the Enterprise survived, if they were on an actual Mobius loop, they were able to get off. But the question is,
Hmm.
how did they get on in the first place?
So, they have had future episodes where people get trapped in time distortions, or they somehow pass through a rip in space time and they're suddenly thrown into multiple universes. I think what happens here, and this kind of gets back into our question about what the actual wormhole is. um,
Exactly. That's the question. Did the
if
wormhole have something to do with it?
I think the wormhole actually has a lot to do with it. I think what the wormhole is kind of like Nagilum
Mm,
from the previous episode, where Silence has lease, which I
yes.
think is episode 2 in this season.
Right.
Um, I think this creature is a dumbed down version of Nagilum, where it goes through and it hunts down specific temporal patterns, in this case, Captain Picard. And this is, again, conjecture on my end based on the information we're given on the episode, because, again, Troy says very clearly, this thing is after you, Captain Picard.
And this is where
Um,
consciousness becomes so important, that issue. Yeah.
yes. Um, I think what happens here is that when Picard first goes inside the the worm, well, the Enterprise first gets trapped inside the wormhole, and Picard escapes, and the Enterprise is destroyed. There's probably some sort of temporal reaction that happened inside of the wormhole that caused a Mobius loop to occur, and Picard is somehow thrown back out 6 hours beforehand and picked up by the Enterprise. Now, the question is, was he thrown into his timeline 6 hours ahead, or was he thrown into an alternate timeline that's 6 hours ahead? Because we're not, I'm not necessarily sure that the wormhole creature, if this thing is a creature, and let's, you know what, for the sake of it, let's say it is, because it has a consciousness.
Sure.
Um, I'm not sure the wormhole creature actually throws Picard in back in time. I think he throws Picard. It throws Picard into an alternate timeline, which is where this episode picks up when the Enterprise is going through the intercore system and finds the shuttle. They find an alternate Captain Picard who's out of phase with this current timeline because his alternate one has essentially ended for him. Um, I think, and you had a really good note. Jordy mentions this loop kind of being the definition of hell, and you made the comparison to the current Netflix series Lucifer, where a lot of the people who are bound to hell are basically bound in these chambers where they suffer their worst experience again and again until they figure their way out of it. Um, I think what happens is that Picard figures out, or kind of instinctually figures out, that this thing is a creature that is sent to consume him. And if it's just a creature, then it has a digestive system. I think at the end of it, Picard just says, well, the worst possible outcome is that we're all going to die, and we're all going to die anyway. So let's go out its asshole, essentially.
Well, I think that there's little hints as to how the puzzle's going to be solved. Like when they get into the
Right,
alternative shuttlecraft and the power input polarity, is negative instead of positive.
right.
So what Riker and Picard sort of get to is that anything we think we should do, we should really do the opposite. They figured that's the best way to get out of the loop. The the other thing you said about that there's an alternate timeline. Once Picard too shows up in the shuttlecraft spinning in space, is there a fork in the timelines where there is a Enterprise timeline where they didn't experience the wormhole at all, and then
Thank you
there's
for.
another one where they did, and that's where the story takes us. Like as Yogi Berra would say, when you get to the fork in the road, take it. Well, in this case, Picard and the Enterprise, they were on this road that was going straight, and all of a sudden there's this little road off to the left, and they ended up taking that road that was 40 degrees off the main course. That's where they ended up going in this story.
So, while you were mentioning that, you brought up a few ideas and a few things that hadn't occurred to me until now. Previously in the original series, there's a couple episodes. I don't know if you remember. There's one where Kirk is transported and he's split into two different beings. Like there's a good Kirk and then there's an
Yeah,
evil Kirk.
yeah, I
And like
remember
the
that one.
end of it is basically like they have to bring the two Kirks back together to balance out who Jim is.
It was a transporter problem. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
There's also, however, established in the original series that there is a mirror universe where there's basically an opposite evil version of everyone else, including a federation that is actually a galactic empire that
Mhm.
has basically taken over everyone. It is so out of character for Jean-Luc Picard to abandon his crew and abandon his ship that I think the thing that's so disturbing for Jean-Luc in this episode is just the very idea that he would be the only one to survive the destruction of his ship, that he wouldn't go down bravely with the rest of them. What if the Picard that he's talking to is actually a mirror universe version of him that is not actually like a. It's not him. It is actually the evil, kind of twisted mirror version of Picard who would abandon the ship.
That's a good point because one of the thing is once Picard is called to the holodeck, I mean, but to the shuttle bay by Dr. Pulaski, and he sees himself, or Picard Prime sees Picard too. He doesn't know what to do with it. I mean, he's barely in control.
None of them do.
He just doesn't know what to do with it. And it's almost like just as Picard too, um, when he comes back and when his the time frame that he's in starts aligning, he comes back to normal. It's almost as if like the idea that there's a, a positive matter and there's an antimatter particle. I mean, there's a little of that in the two Picards when they're existing together after Picard 2 is found on the shuttle. So as the timelines converge, that 6 hours passes, it's almost like Picard Prime starts to figure things out. He works to get in control of the situation where initially he is flustered, totally flustered, and doesn't understand. And I think he has a lot of the emotions that you stated, like, how the hell could I be the only one to survive?
Well, this gets back to what I was saying about novel occurrences, and how systems deal with the damage when they happen. Imagine you are living your life every day, just doing your normal thing, and then all of a sudden someone comes and tells you in 6 hours, everyone you know, including you, and everyone you love, is going to die. And there's nothing you can do because in 6 hours this is going to happen. Like, and they even establish in the episode pretty well that, like, this is the point that they're going to reach. And because of the nature of time, no matter, they can make an infinite variety of choices, but this seems to be set. I think existentially and cognitively, when you know that's going to happen, and I imagine it would be interesting to ask someone who's terminal with an illness about this, but like when you know that the end is nigh and you're kind of absolutely certain of it, it's kind of miraculous that the entire ship doesn't break down right then and there into chaos. That's 1,000 people that are going to die in 6 hours. And do you know what they do? They rely on the system still. They go through the process of trying to figure things out, even to the point where Dr. Pulaski, and it's a very interesting. Actually, before I get to Pulaski, right after they have the revelation of what's going on, when Geordi says, we finally pulled the data banks from the shuttle in the future, and they figure out what happens. There's this really interesting part where they're leaving the observation lounge, which is behind the bridge, and Riker walks out and Worf, and they both kind of pause and look at the bridge around them, and they kind of both realize, like, this is it. We have
Mm,
6 hours to figure out what's going on, or we're
mhm,
all dead.
mhm.
I can only imagine I can't even imagine what the pressure of that psychologically would be like if you knew that time was ticking away like that. And it really is kind of miraculous that everyone stays together, including Picard. Um, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm kind of just droning on a little bit.
No,
Am I off base here, or is this? It's kind of. I think this episode speaks well to the function of the crew, and this gets to the conversation I wanted to have about Riker's pointing out Picard's Persian flaw.
yeah, I wanted to ask about that, but I'm thinking, we make the assumption I don't think there's any mention of the reaction of the crew, so we're making the assumption that since the word would get out that they didn't try to hide the fact that there was Picard too, so you're making the assumption that the crew knew something that was going on, but how much did they really know?
Right.
Um,
Well, the entire bridge crew knows.
the entire bridge crew knows, right?
And assuming they're not telling everyone else on the ship,
Mm-hmm.
um, in terms of the story, all the main characters, the main players on the stage, everyone knows that the play is about to come to an end
Mm-hmm.
in their minds.
Mm-hmm.
That just has to be an existentially difficult thing to deal with in general.
Well, I'm thinking about it too because this comes up in a lot of, disaster films and so forth.
Right.
Um, deep impact, to some extent Armageddon. There's been a bunch of films like that, and I guess I've never thought about, you deal with the fact, boy, these people are in a really bad spot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how would they really react to it? The one that comes into mind, because it's a movie I watched for the first time like last summer, was on the beach,
Mm-hmm.
about Australia in a post nuclear exchange in the northern hemisphere, and that's a very striking film because quickly what happens is that Australia is initially isolated from this cloud of radiation that's been released in the northern hemisphere by a nuclear war between mainly, the Russians and the Americans. I guess the Chinese may be involved, but they know it's going to come and it's lethal. And as it crosses the Australian continent, particularly on all the large cities on the eastern seaboard, Brisbane down to Melbourne, around to Adelaide. And I think Melbourne is where this movie takes place. The Australian populace decides that rather than us all suffering from radiation poisoning, having agonizing deaths, we're going to pick a day and we're all going to take these pills that the government provides us and kill ourselves. And that's
Right.
and that's what they do. But they had some time to think about what they were going to do. So you bring up a good point that if it's a group of people were in a situation like that, how would they really react?
And I think the
There's,
beauty of, yeah.
I mean,
Well,
there's
I think
some stories where, people think the end is near, so I'm just going to go get drunk, I'm going to go rape, I'm going to go murder, I'm going to go crazy and do what I want. I don't know. Some people might end up actually doing that.
I I think that stories like The Martian by Andy Weir and stories like Star Trek actually reveal more what humanity would do if we were equipped with the proper tools. What the crew does in this case is that they get to work. They get to work trying to figure out what's going on. They try to, Card and Riker don't just throw their hands up and just say, "Well, we're going to wait to die and see the ship explode." Throughout the entire episode, they rely on their Starfleet. They rely on their Starfleet or cosmonaut training or their
Mm-hmm.
astronaut training to get through the problems. Do the math, do the work. Tr- don't just give up. Try to figure out a way around this obstacle in front of you, even to the point of like considering things that you've never had to consider before. The conversation that Picard and Riker have about Picard's Persian flaw, about Picard constantly needs to have a logical discourse within himself and come up with a considered executive decision so he can lead on the fly. And in this case, he doesn't have the ability to lead on the fly because he knows what's going to happen. The ship's going to be destroyed. So, what do you do in that situation? Well, you have to think outside of the typical box. I can't make an executive decision because I'm not in control of this. What do I do? Well, I cede control to a certain extent to fate and see what happens along the way. You know, the obvious answer that Picard 2 has is that he has to abandon the ship because he thinks this creature is so targeted on him that if he's gone, it will leave the Enterprise alone. That's proven not to be true. So instead of repeating, Picard Prime decides, I'm actually going to fall into my Persian flaw. He actually disagrees with Riker in the end and does something that Jean-Luc Picard would do. He would rely on the crew in front of him. Would rely on his training. And I think there's one thing about Starfleet and Starfleet officers that we take for granted a lot. Um, to go into space and to explore the unknown, and to just be an explorer in general, you have to look death in the face and say "fuck you" and drive as fast and as hard as you can right into it, not knowing if you're going to come out the other side or not. I think you and I had, it may have been an offline discussion, but we had the discussion about the Apollo 13 mission.
Yeah.
Those
I th-
guys had, sorry, I
no,
didn't
I think
mean
the
to.
way you just explained what risk Starfleet officers have to understand they're subjecting themselves to. We were a couple of days ago, we're together and we were watching the first Star Trek with Chris Pine and
The 2009 reboot.
the 2009 reboot. And of course, that is in the beginning, the cadet James T. Kirk figures out how to beat the Kobayashi
Kobayashi. Maru. Yeah.
Maru. And, during the court appearance and so forth, before they're all going out to deal with Nero, Spock explains to Kirk, Cadet Kirk, what the purpose of the Kobayashi Maru experience is for the captain or the officer to experience total fear and to realize how they need to stay in control even when all is lost. And of course, Kirk's philosophy, I don't believe in no-win scenarios,
Exactly.
which is something specifically happens in all the Star Trek captains and so on. But I think the way you explained what Starfleet officers need to understand what they're exposing them to is actually a better explanation than what Spock gave in that movie. It's more
Well,
practical because when Spock explains to Cadet Kirk why it is, it's like, well, yeah, but what do you get out of it? I mean, yeah, you're basically telling them you're going to go into space and you might die.
well, like that scene is important. Oh Jesus, I'm gonna cry because like that scene is important because we don't get the automatic rebuttal to Spock's point about the Kobayashi Maru. Spock, played by Zachary Quinto, masterfully, might I add, um, in that scene tries to hammer home the point to Kirk that you have to accept death, and Kirk should understand this, being the son of
George Kirk,
God,
yeah,
George Kirk, who died
on
um,
the USS Kelvin.
on the USS Kelvin. But what Spock doesn't understand is that the decision that George Kirk makes to sacrifice his own life is the thing that allows so many others to survive. It's Captain Picard being willing to turn and face the wormhole creature and drive his entire ship into it is the Hail Mary that allows them to survive. You have to be that one person sometimes in life in the most dire situation that's willing to look at the gyre and say, fuck it, we're going into it, because at the very worst, um, you know, last episode we talked about the Charybdis and the Scala from the Odyssey,
Mm-hmm.
and people forget like what that situation is. Odysseus has a choice. He can either go by Scala and lose, like, I think it was like half of his crew to the monster,
Right, Scylla, I
or
think it's pronounced.
Scylla,
Yeah,
Scylla,
yeah,
right? He could go by Scylla and was basically guaranteed to lose half his crew to the monster, or he could risk Charybdis and possibly lose his crew or his entire boat, and including his own life to the monster. But there was the possibility he saw that he could get past. He decides to go past Charybdis and ultimately survives Charybdis. It's having the ability and the courage to make that decision in that no-win scenario to find that win some way, somehow. Um, in the case that you never expect it. We have this in human history. At some point, someone on Omaha Beach was sitting in that surf, hunkered down behind something, having decided to go forward or die. And the truth is, they could have crawled out of that ocean and have been shot in the next moment. And I know I'm talking about Saving Private Ryan for a moment, but like those are the kind of situations that people have to face sometimes in life, and you have to have that kind of fuck it. There's no-win scenarios for me, and literally run into the hail of bullets if you're going to see through what needs to be done. It's a real commentary in leadership.
when you mention that type of leadership, what popped into mind immediately was Winston Churchill.
As as controversial as he is now, yes. Well, like Churchill saw, as patronizing, as patriarchal, and as colonial as Churchill was, and as we're coming to find out racist, Churchill saw the problem that he saw that it was a no-win situation between appeasing the Nazis or being bombed by the Nazis. So he literally had to make a decision. Am I going to let these people run us over and basically destroy European culture as he saw it,
Right. What
or
gets
will I
back
fight
into
them and face possible annihilation?
what we're talking about of establishing the rules. And he
Right.
consistently did not trust Hitler, said the guy's breaking the rules all the time. He's lying all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody should trust him. He's going to cause a problem. And he did. And then he took the brunt of the problem. And he didn't handle the problem very well to begin with, but he stuck to it. He never surrendered and he ended up winning.
Well, there is so much risk in life in general that if you don't have the wherewithal to, and this is kind of where I get into my own philosophy. Um, I believe that the strongest people in life are these people that I term grinders, and they're the kind of people that when they're faced with dire adversity and like real things like death, poverty, homelessness, starvation, these are the kind of people that somehow buckle down and through the sheer force of their unrelenting will, they find a way to survive and thrive and ultimately succeed in those situations. One person I think of off the top of my head, I'm a big fight fan. The current UFC World Heavyweight Champion is this Cameroonian heavyweight named Francis Ngannou. He came from Cameroon, where from the time he was a child, he worked in the sand pits, digging sand. And the way he escaped to Europe to become a fighter is that he had to illegally immigrate from Africa. And what the Cameroonian and the French government used to do to immigrants is almost worse than what we do to Central American and Latin immigrants who are crossing our border. Like, if you're caught on either side trying to get from Africa to Europe, like, Francis was literally left in the desert with other immigrants, just left in the desert without water and clothes at one point. And he tried 4 different times to get into Europe over a year, and both governments literally tried to kill him by like abandoning him in the desert or abandoning him on the sea. Like, and he grew up digging in salt and digging sand pits for like, industrial sand. There is a I'm telling you the story of an individual who has had to survive such physical, emotional, and psychological hardship that they are tougher on a level that you can't even perceive in your white, privileged, comfortable Western world. And this is,
Mhm.
kind of getting on a dovetail, and I'll stop talking here because we need to end the episode soon. We we really don't understand how lucky we have it to be where we are right now having the conversation we're having, because in other parts of the world right now we would not be able to have this conversation out loud or even record or broadcast without the fear of possibly being killed for it. And yeah, I know we're talking about Star Trek, but philosophically some of the things that we're talking about here would seem dangerous to other societies.
Oh, sure. Or we'd be in a country where they didn't know about Star Trek. They wouldn't even consider having a conversation like this.
Oh
They
yeah.
wouldn't even think about the possibility of it.
And it's why I value people like Francis Ngannou, who are grinders who want to come to this country and succeed because they've been to places or they were born in places that are literal hellscapes. Like, immigrants aren't just coming here for the fun of it, they're escaping hell because this seems like heaven in
Well,
comparison.
well, I think that's something that, just with some of the people that are coming from Guatemala, there was one mother who said, I'm going to send my child to the U.S. because It's literally a matter of life and death. If they stay here, they'll die. The other thing I've always thought about immigrants, yeah, there are some immigrants like what the Brits did when they created the Botany Bay colony. The first Australian
Oh, right.
settlers were all prisoners and so forth, which, the British did a lot of shitty things, and that's one of them. Um, but if you look at American immigration, there were people fleeing religious prosecution, persecution. But I think a lot of people I know just from our family who left Germany in 1850, it was after the revolution of 1848. And there's a lot of people that weren't satisfied with the political structure in post Napoleonic Europe, and they thought they could go to a better place. And I think you have to give immigrants, whether they're from Germany or England or Ireland or Scotland or, wherever, that for them to get on a ship as they existed back then and go to a new world and not have any certainty of whether they'd be able to survive. Those were strong people. The
Oh, yeah.
people that weren't strong just said, "Yeah, I'm here in Germany and life sucks, but I'm not getting on that boat." Who would you rather come? From a competitive uh, aspect that they could do well, that they could contribute to
Absolutely.
society. I'd much rather have the courageous people who had the balls to get on the boat.
Well, like, you're talking about the difference between people who accept the certainty of hell versus the uncertainty of possible liberation from hell. Like, that's the real difference of what we're talking about here. The people who stay in Syria are willing to accept the idea that killing people with chemical weapons is a tolerable thing as long as it doesn't happen to them. The people who are leaving Syria are the ones who are fleeing, possibly being doused with chemical weapons and dying. Um, it's just a completely different mindset that I think a lot of us take for granted. And when we talk about immigrants, I think that we talk about them unfairly because they don't want to just be here because of the material gains. There is a philosophical reason they are here that goes beyond, simple questions of loyalty or national identity. It really is questions of existential being. Like for a lot of people, the ability to go to a first world nation. Let's talk about America. Like going to first world nations like England or Sweden or going to Canada. Those are opportunities for people that they would not be able to find in their native countries in many cases. Economic, social, even religious opportunities. A lot of Muslims come here to North America because the version of Islam they grew up with in the Middle East is sometimes so extreme that for them to practice just a normal kind of um, Sunni version of Islam that is based on community outreach and community input and community interaction that doesn't involve AK-47s. Like they literally have to leave the Middle East so they don't have to practice their religion with AK-47s.
Sure,
That's what
absolutely.
Muslims in America want to be here to do. They want to be able to bow their heads 5 times a day without hearing bullets outside. Like that's a very important distinction that I think gets lost in all this. Like people aren't just leaving to leave and they're not just coming here to mooch. They're coming here because the place that they're leaving sucks and the thing that they want to do here is take part in the wondrous experiment this place is supposed to be.
Supposed to be, right.
And part of facing that experiment and part of that experiment is facing the uncertainty. Like, I don't want to commend the founding fathers anymore too much because one of the things that we have to deal with now in the era we live in is facing the reality of what their actual actions were versus their stated morals and ethics. And sometimes those things aren't congruent,
No,
unfortunately.
No.
But it took a lot of guts and the willingness to face a certainty of death to go up against a king across the sea who is willing to tax you to death to pay for his irresponsible wars. Like, all of those people in that Congress in Philadelphia, was it Philadelphia? Where were they? Were they in Philly or were they in Virginia?
No,
They
they were
weren't in
in.
Boston.
No, 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 no. They were in Philadelphia, in what's now what Constitution Hall or whatever. But yeah,
Right. So
Independence Hall, right?
all those men who sat there after they had sent multiple petitions to George, they all literally sat in that building and they all looked at each other and they said, "Yep, I'm willing to be hanged for this shit just so I can have some level of
It
independence."
was portrayed very well in the John Adams series when they took the vote, and there was no applauding, there was no celebration. It was
Right.
total silence, where over the solemnity and the commitment, the blood oath they had taken with one another.
Well, even Washington choosing to be head of the Continental Army, like, he's not choosing a promotion and he's not choosing an opportunity. In many ways, Washington chose a death sentence. That if it didn't work, like, he's not going to go on to the next job and he's not going to go to some prison and he's not going to, like, just have his land seized. He's going to be hanged from a bridge in London. Like,
Mhm.
it's a very different thing I think people don't take into account when it comes to the difficult things that have to happen for what we call progress. Often, for us to get to the next step, we have to take the often sometimes dumb, foolhardy, and uncertain task of facing down the unknown.
And that all gets back to the episode because that's what Picard does in the end and saves
Ultimately,
Enterprise. Yeah,
well, like, the Picard that he ultimately kills, Picard 2, is a creature that's built on this constant of certainty. And the
exactly.
real
Right.
the real trick that Picard Prime discovers is that, okay, my real Persian flaw is that I have to be certain. For a moment, let me be uncertain and not rely on myself and my own decision making, but rely on the people around me and the situation I'm in, and just see this through for what it's going to be. Because just like those astronauts on Apollo 13, they had to go through the dark of the moon. They knew that they were going to have to walk through that shadow and
Hmm.
deal with the cold if they wanted to see the other side and possibly see Earth again. It's the exact same thing that happens here in Times Squared.
Right.
Um, Before we go, Dad, how do you feel about the episode? Did you enjoy it? Where does it rank for you?
Um, I
See
thought
us out.
it was a interesting episode. Again, it's a story that's very tight. Um, there's more or
Right.
less really only one. There's not a side story to it. I think it keeps your interest because there are some, again, unsolved mysteries here. Gives you some food for thought to chew on and so on. And I think just from an entertainment standpoint of going back to April 3rd of 1989, people watching it back then would say, that was a fun episode to watch.
Right. Can I say one thing about this episode before we
Sure.
go?
Yeah.
Great use of music. Like, one thing about this episode that's very good aesthetically is that it's stripped down to where the Enterprise is almost a stage. There isn't like a lot of technology or things being used. The phaser could be a gun that Picard shoots his doppelganger with in a different sort of genre. I think the real beauty of this episode, though, is in the music. The music adds so much tension to some of the
Hmm.
scenes.
Hmm.
But on that note, uh, Dad, thank you so much for joining us for
Thanks, Jay.
another
Yes.
episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. We will see everyone next time for Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, season 2, episode 14, The Icarus Factor. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Night.